The gavel slammed. Judge Beryl Howell's voice echoed with the force of a woman certain of her authority, reverberating through the hushed chamber. Every ear in the courtroom caught the sharp tone, every eye locked on the bench where Howell sat draped in black robes that seemed to amplify her dominance. And then came the words, delivered not as suggestion, but as decree. A sanction was on the table. The air shifted instantly. Whispers flickered like sparks across the gallery. Cameras clicked in staccato bursts, each flash capturing the split-second shock etched on faces across the room. Howell wasn't just threatening disciplinary action, she was sending a message. Know your place. But this wasn't just any defendant. This was Jasmine Crockett. To the establishment, Howell's words may have sounded like routine courtroom discipline. But to those watching closely, it carried the weight of something darker. The old guard flexing its muscle against a voice that dared not to bow. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was the stunned intake of breath from an audience, who knew they were standing at the edge of a storm. Crockett sat upright, every line of her body poised with the grace of someone who had faced fire before. She didn't flinch. She didn't fumble, where others might shrink under the glare of judicial power. She radiated a calm, so deliberate it unsettled the room even more than Howell's gavel. The tension crystallized into a tableau of contrasts. On one side, the stern embodiment of institutional control cloaked in entitlement and authority. On the other, a woman who had clawed her way past every barrier designed to silence her, forced to decide whether to yield or to rise. Gasps echoed again as Howell leaned forward, her words heavy with implied finality. To many it felt like a warning. To others it felt like the weight of centuries, the same command that had always been aimed at anyone who refused to know their place. But Crockett wasn't just defending herself. In that moment, she carried the weight of everyone who had ever been dismissed, talked over, or sanctioned for daring to speak truth in the wrong room. And then, as the entire chamber braced for submission, she opened her mouth. This wasn't just about a sanction. To the casual observer, it may have seemed like a procedural skirmish, a judge flexing her authority to rein in a voice that had grown too sharp. But for those who had been following Jasmine Crockett's rise, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Crockett had never been the kind, a figurehead content to blend into the wallpaper of politics. She was loud when truth demanded volume, unflinching when power demanded compliance, and unapologetic about who she was, a black woman in a system that had never been designed for her voice to carry. That authenticity, that unfiltered defiance, had propelled her beyond the backbenches of obscurity into a rising force that couldn't be ignored, and that was exactly the problem. For the establishment, the old guard of politics, was the polished class that thrived on decorum, masking decay. Crockett wasn't just an inconvenience. She was a threat. Her words cut through pretense. Her presence cracked the illusion of harmony. And when someone like that refuses to bow, the machine doesn't argue. It punishes. So Howell's sanction wasn't random. It was strategic. Was the system doing what it had always done? Dress up its discomfort in the language of order, and strike down the voices that rattled the gilded cage. In this courtroom, the sanction carried more than legal weight. It carried symbolic destruction. If Howell succeeded in branding Crockett as reckless, undisciplined, or disrespectful, her credibility could collapse in real time. The narrative would flip. Crockett wouldn't be the brave truth-teller. She'd be painted as the disruptive novice who didn't know her place, and for someone whose power rested on moral authority, that stain could linger far longer than the gavel's echo. But if Crockett held firm, if she resisted the attempt to diminish her, then the victory would extend far beyond her own career. It would signal something larger, something electrifying, that even in the most hostile arenas, dignity could outlast intimidation, that free speech wasn't just a slogan, it was a lifeline, that minority voices so often dismissed as too emotional or too radical had the right to speak with the same force as those who had dominated the chamber for centuries. Every eye in that courtroom understood the collision underway. It wasn't just Crockett versus Howell. It was courage versus control, integrity versus arrogance, earned respect versus blind obedience. Whispers carried through the gallery. Some leaned forward, hungry for Crockett's collapse, ready to nod. Along with Howell's lecture, clenched their fists in solidarity, silently urging her to resist. Outside the courtroom, the press waited with sharpened pens, ready to spin whichever narrative triumphed inside. Would Crockett walk out branded as another radical, silenced by authority? Or would she emerge as the woman who turned a sanction into a stand? The implications stretched wider than the walls could contain. If Crockett fell, it would embolden every figure of authority who sought to muzzle dissent. It would whisper to every young activist, every woman of color watching, "Speak too loudly, and this will be your fate." But if she rose, it would ignite something far more dangerous for the establishment: hope. Hope that their grip wasn't unbreakable. Hope that the game could be played differently, and the silence grew thick, each second dragging like an eternity. Howell adjusted her robe. Her tone sharpened, her authority swelling as if to tighten the noose. This wasn't just about order anymore. It was about domination. But Crockett wasn't blinking. Her calm wasn't passivity. It was preparation. She wasn't yielding. She was calculating. Judge Beryl Howell was not a figure one stumbled past without notice. In Washington's labyrinth of courts, she had carved a reputation sharp enough to leave scars. Lawyers whispered her name with a mixture of respect and dread. Journalists wrote of her as a disciplinarian of the bench, someone who never tolerated the smallest deviation from her code of order. And those who had appeared before her knew one unshakable truth: Howell ruled her courtroom like a fortress. And her word was law. Her journey to that power was marked by ambition and precision. Rising through the legal ranks, Howell earned praise for her intellect and her ability to dissect arguments down to their bones. She was not sloppy, not sentimental. Too many, she represented the ideal judge, dispassionate, rigorous, and utterly committed to the sanctity of the institution she served. But beneath that veneer of professional excellence, a harsher current flowed. Howell wasn't merely enforcing the law, she was enforcing herself. Over time, patterns emerged. Defense attorneys accused her of wielding her authority as a weapon, silencing those who didn't conform to her sense of propriety. Critics noted her tendency to lecture from the bench, turning rulings into sermons. Colleagues privately remarked that she seemed to relish the spectacle of control, as though each case wasn't about justice, but about reaffirming her supremacy in the courtroom. Her rulings often reflected this edge. She had handed down decisions that carried not just weight, but sting. Lawyers left her courtroom chastened, reputations dented, sometimes careers halted. Those who tried to spar with her found themselves cut down mid-sentence, their arguments dismissed not with logic, but with the sheer blunt force of her authority. For Howell, the gavel wasn't a tool of order, it was a hammer of dominance. And in Washington, this reputation carried power. She was feared, yes, but also admired by the establishment that prized predictability. They could count on Howell to keep the boundaries intact, to keep challengers in check. Her sternness was seen as stability, her sharp tongue as strength. To the insiders, she was exactly what they needed: a guardian of the system, willing to enforce its rules with an iron fist. But to those outside the system, to those whose voices already strained against the margins, Howell symbolized something darker. She was the face of an establishment allergic to disruption, allergic to authenticity, allergic to the kind of raw honesty that refused to bow to decorum. For them, Howell wasn't just a judge, she was a gatekeeper, guarding the door against the very possibility of change. It was this contrast that set the stage for her. Clash with Jasmine Crockett. Crockett was everything Howell was not. Where Howell was cold precision, Crockett was warm conviction. Where Howell leaned on tradition, Crockett thrived on disruption. Howell cloaked herself in authority. Ow! Crockett disarmed with authenticity. Howell thrived on hierarchy, Crockett on connection. The two women, both powerful in their own right, represented not just different temperaments, but different philosophies of power itself, and Howell, in her confidence, believed she already knew the ending of this story.
She had seen
Challengers before ambitious attorneys, outspoken defendants, even seasoned politicians who tried to test her authority. Every one of them eventually bent beneath the weight of her stare, her gavel, her rulings. To Howell, Crockett would be no different. She was young, relatively new, still untested in the gladiatorial arena of Washington's power games. Expected her to break the way others had broken, burst of fire followed by quiet compliance. That overconfidence was Howell's blind spot. Because Crockett wasn't walking into the courtroom alone, she carried the weight of those who had been silenced, the hopes of those who saw in her a voice unafraid to call out hypocrisy. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending a principle, a presence, an entire community that Howell's brand of authority had long kept at bay. Still, Howell didn't see it. In her mind, this was another test of control, another performance of dominance. She straightened her robe, adjusted her glasses, and prepared to deliver yet another lecture that would remind the room who held the power. The cameras, the journalists, the onlookers, they were all props in her theater. But what Howell didn't know, what she couldn't yet anticipate, was that her courtroom would no longer play by her script. This wasn't going to be another lecture ending in silence. This wasn't going to be another win chalked up to her record of intimidation. For the first time, she wasn't just facing an opponent. She was facing a challenger whose authenticity was immune to her cold authority, whose presence couldn't be shrunk by the weight of a robe or the slam of a gavel. Asterisk long before the clash with Judge Beryl Howell. Jasmine Crockett's life had been defined by an unyielding confrontation with silence, the kind imposed on those society often ignores. Her rise did not begin in the gilded halls of power, but in neighborhoods where opportunity was rationed, where dignity was a currency, constantly devalued. From her earliest days, Crockett understood that if you wanted justice, you couldn't wait for permission. You had to claim it, speak it, and defend it. She was the daughter of a working-class family, raised among people who believed in sacrifice, but rarely saw reward. Crockett watched her community wrestle with cycles of neglect, schools underfunded, promises unkept, voices unheard. For many, this reality became a reason to lower expectations. For her, it became fuel. She resolved not to leave her people behind, not to climb for her own sake, but to prove that those who had been ignored could stand eye to eye with power and demand recognition. When she chose the law as her weapon, it wasn't out of prestige, but necessity. Crockett walked into courtrooms, already stacked against the people she defended, young men labeled before trial, families buried under bureaucracy, women dismissed before they even spoke. In those rooms, she learned how justice bends not to truth but to force, and it was here she also learned her craft, how to wield clarity as a blade, how to ground herself when opponents sought to rattle her. Case by case, she became less an attorney and more a defender of dignity itself. But Crockett's battles weren't only professional. She had faced the quiet humiliations that marked so many from marginalized backgrounds. The raised eyebrows when she spoke too boldly, the subtle suggestions that she didn't belong, the whispered critiques that she was too direct too passionate, too much. Each remark was meant to shrink her, but instead, each became a scar she wore proudly, proof that she had rattled the gatekeepers who preferred compliance over courage. When she eventually entered politics, skepticism only sharpened. She was not part of dynastic families, not groomed by elite institutions. She arrived as an outsider, propelled not by establishment machinery, but by the faith of neighbors who saw in her someone unwilling to bow. Not in careful rehearsed lines, but with the raw urgency of someone who had lived the struggles she named. Crowds didn't just listen. They recognized themselves in her. She wasn't promising to be their voice. She was their voice. And Congress, with its polished rituals and unspoken hierarchies, didn't quite know what to do with her. In a chamber where tradition often suffocates truth, Crockett stood as a reminder that institutions should serve people, not the other way around. Speeches weren't designed to flatter colleagues or climb ladders. They were sharp, unvarnished, sometimes uncomfortable, but always authentic. She understood that representation wasn't about blending in. It was about standing out in precisely the way the powerful wanted you to quiet down. Her rise made her both admired and resented. Admirers saw a woman who had turned survival into strength. Resenters saw someone unwilling to bow to unspoken rules. To them, she was disruptive. To her supporters, she was necessary. Every confrontation she endured, every moment she refused to be silenced, deepened her reputation as someone who embodied more than herself. Crockett became a stand-in for every woman who had been told she was too loud, for every immigrant who had been told to wait their turn, for every working-class dreamer who had been told this isn't for you. Her backstory was not simply biography, it was armor. It meant that when she entered that courtroom facing Judge Howell, she carried with her more than her own name. She carried the weight of countless others who had faced authority and been told to sit down. And unlike many who faced that command, Crockett had both the skill and the will to rise. That was the true source of her power, not a hunger for spotlight, but a refusal to betray the people who believed in her. Every sanctioned threat, every sneer from authority, every attempt to reduce her to a caricature, all of it only reinforced why she was there in the first place. Crockett was not fighting to save face. She was fighting to prove that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken away. The courtroom was hushed, yet charged. As if the very walls understood that what was about to unfold would not simply be a legal exchange but a clash of wills, of worlds. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her robe flowing like authority itself. Her voice measured but edged with the steel of someone accustomed to compliance. Congresswoman Crockett, Howell began, drawing out the title as though it carried a question mark rather than respect. You will remember that this courtroom is governed by rules. Passion has its place, but here discipline and restraint must prevail. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They dripped. With the subtle condescension of power, a reminder that Howell's gavel was not just a piece of wood, but a weapon of order. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance. It was the kind of admonition meant to cut a person down without raising its voice. Crockett inhaled slowly, her eyes never breaking from Howell's. Her response came not in haste, but in precision, like a blade drawn deliberately. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her tone calm yet unwavering, discipline is not silence, and restraint is not surrender. I came here not for theatrics, but for truth, and the truth does not always arrive politely. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some heads nodded subtly. Others stiffened as though witnessing a breach of sacred order. The tension wasn't loud, but it was palpable, a collective heartbeat quickening. Howell's brow tightened. This is not a pulpit, Congresswoman. This is a court of law. You would do well to remember the boundaries. Boundaries. The word lingered like smoke. Crockett let it sit for a moment, then leaned slightly forward, her voice lowering just enough to draw the gallery closer. Boundaries, Judge Howell, she replied evenly, are often drawn to keep people out, to keep the powerful in and the powerless contained. But my entire life has been spent challenging boundaries designed to tell people like me, the people I represent, to know their place. The words struck with quiet force, not shouted, not dramatic but undeniable. The murmurs grew again like a tide swelling just below the surface. Howell tapped her gavel once, sharp but restrained. You are skirting dangerously close to contempt, Congresswoman. I advise you to tread carefully. Carefully. Another word of caution disguised as authority. The judge's voice carried the certainty that Crockett, like so many before her, would step back, recalibrate, obey. That was the choreography this chamber had rehearsed for centuries, authority warns. Subject yields, but Crockett didn't yield. She straightened, her shoulders squaring with quiet defiance, her tone still measured. Still steady, Your Honor. If speaking truth is contempt, then I will bear it gladly. Because contempt is not mine, it belongs to every system that tries to silence those who have something real to say. The air shifted. It was no longer a courtroom simply enforcing rules. It was a theater of confrontation, each sentence tightening. The coil of tension. The gallery sat, suspended between awe and unease, aware they were witnessing something rare, someone refusing to let centuries of deference dictate their words. Howell's lips parted as if to retort, but the pause gave her away. The certainty of authority had met something it couldn't easily categorize, a defiance wrapped not in shouting, but in poise. Congresswoman Crockett Howell said finally, her tone sharper, the robe of authority feeling thinner now. You will not grandstand in this court. This is your final warning. Silence fell. The gallery stopped breathing. The weight of the moment pressed like a storm about to break. And then Crockett leaned forward, her eyes steady, her voice cutting through the silence like a bell. The silence in the courtroom was no longer stillness. It was tension stretched so tight it could snap at the faintest sound. Every gaze was fixed on Jasmine Crockett, who stood not as a guest in Judge Howell's court but as a challenger. A woman unafraid to test the weight of authority. For a fleeting second, the only sound was the creak of wooden benches as people leaned forward, and Crockett spoke, her voice measured, deliberate, carrying not volume but gravity. Your Honor, she began, her words unfolding with the rhythm of someone who had prepared not a script but a truth. You speak of boundaries, of discipline, of rules. But I must remind this court that boundaries do not exist in a vacuum. They are defined by the Constitution, not by robes, not by gavels, not by the preferences of one judge. Her hand rested lightly on the table before her, not clenched, not shaking, calm, controlled. The gallery exhaled collectively, as though they had been waiting to be given permission to breathe again. Howell adjusted her glasses, her tone clipped, betraying a sliver of unease. Congresswoman, this court recognizes the Constitution well enough without a lecture. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the challenge. Respectfully, Judge Howell, history would beg to differ. For centuries, people of power have claimed to recognize the Constitution while bending it to their will, while using its words selectively, while ignoring the people it was meant to protect. Recognition is not enough. Fidelity is required. The words struck with quiet force. Somewhere in the back of the room, a spectator whispered, "My God," before being hushed by the marshals. The sound was barely audible, but it carried. The gallery wasn't just watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a dismantling. Howell cleared her throat, her tone firmer now, the robe around her shoulders seeming heavier. This line of commentary is inappropriate. You will return to the matter at hand, or I will butt Crockett. Raised a single finger, not an interruption, but in a gesture of stillness. She waited, letting silence fall again, letting the tension spiral until the judge herself seemed caught in it. Only then did she continue. The matter at hand, Crockett said softly, is precisely this: whether authority exists to serve the people or to silence them. Whether law is a shield for justice or a weapon for control. And I refuse to pretend. That distinction is irrelevant because it has cost too many lives, too much history, too much silence already. The cadence of her words had shifted now, slow, deliberate, with a poetic rhythm that landed each sentence like a gavel of its own. The Constitution is not a robe. It is not a gavel. It is not a chair raised above the people. It is words written in hope, words that demand we live up to more than ceremony. It is the promise that no judge, no politician, no system may strip truth from those who dare to speak. It gasps, punctured the quiet. A woman in the gallery clutched her chest. Another man leaned forward, eyes wide, his lips forming the word yes, without sound. The murmurs that followed weren't disorderly. They were reverent. Like an audience realizing they were hearing something that would be quoted long after this day. Judge Howell shifted in her chair, tapping the gavel once, then twice, as if the sound could restore the balance. But the balance was gone. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, Howell wasn't the most commanding voice in her own courtroom. You tread dangerously close, Howell said, though the words lacked the sting of before. They sounded defensive now, less certain, more fragile. Crockett paused, her silence deliberate, her gaze steady. And then she struck again, this time with history itself as her blade. Dangerously close? Tell that to those who risked everything. To march across bridges when courts told them to wait. Tell that to those who sat at lunch counters when judges said their cause was premature. Tell that to the women who fought for the right to vote when authority insisted they were asking for too much. Every step toward justice has been called dangerous. Every truth-teller has been warned they were too close. Her words rolled like thunder, steady, echoing. Leaving no corner of the chamber untouched, the gallery erupted in murmurs again. Some hands clapping before being quickly silenced. Howell banged the gavel, but each strike sounded hollow now, swallowed by the echo of Crockett's words. "You will not turn this court into a spectacle," Howell insisted, her voice straining. But Crockett did not raise her own voice to meet it. Instead, she lowered it, calm as ever, and in doing so forced everyone to lean closer, to listen harder. "This is not spectacle, Your Honor. This is accountability. And accountability is not always comfortable." The room was utterly still. Even the court reporters hesitated, their fingers briefly frozen above their keys. The moment had transcended ordinary transcription. Then came the pause. Crockett let her words hang, let the silence bloom again, let the anticipation stretch. She paced it like a musician holding the note just long enough to make the release inevitable. Finally, she delivered the line that broke through like lightning. "And if truth spoken in this courtroom is contempt, then let history show I chose contempt over complicity." The gallery gasped as one. A woman covered her mouth. A man muttered, "Lord have mercy," under his breath. Even the marshals, stoic by training, shifted slightly. Betraying their awareness that they were witnessing a moment larger than duty, Howell's lips parted. But no words came immediately. Her eyes flickered annoyance, disbelief, something bordering on uncertainty. For perhaps the first time in her career, Judge Beryl Howell looked rattled. The robe no longer armor but weight. She struck the gavel again, once, twice, 3 times. But the sound no longer commanded silence, it only underscored it. The authority she had wielded for decades now seemed diminished, refracted, as if the room itself had redefined where power truly rested. Crockett remained still, not triumphant. Not smirking, but resolute. The crowd's awe filled the silence like air after a storm, heavy yet electric. The whispered disbelief swirled through the room, carrying her words beyond the benches, beyond the gallery, beyond the courthouse itself. The clip spread faster than wildfire. Within minutes of leaving that courtroom, the moment was everywhere. Social media timelines flooded with Crockett's words, clipped, subtitled, remixed into TikToks and Reels. On X, hashtags like #CrockettClapsBack, #Dignity over Arrogance, and #Truth and Power trended nationwide. One user wrote, "This isn't just a response, this is a masterclass." Another declared, "We just witnessed the future of political leadership." Memes followed almost instantly. Someone looped Howell's face right after Crockett's line, the stiff jaw, flicker of disbelief, and captioned it, "When the boss realizes the intern actually knows the rule book better." Others posted side-by-side screenshots. Howell, framed in shadow, stern and overbearing, versus Crockett lit with a clarity that looked almost cinematic. The narrative was no longer confined to a courtroom. It was being authored by the people cable news couldn't resist. CNN cut to the exchange repeatedly, anchors remarking on Crockett's composure. MSNBC panels replayed the clip in slow motion, pointing out how her pauses weren't hesitation but deliberate, devastating beats of control. Even Fox News, though critical, couldn't help acknowledging the impact. One commentator, visibly unsettled, admitted, "Whether you agree with her or not, Crockett seized that courtroom." But this wasn't just about theatrics. For many watching, especially younger audiences in communities who'd felt dismissed or silenced, the moment carried weight. Crockett wasn't just another politician surviving a tough hearing. She was living proof that dignity could face down arrogance and win. College students posted about feeling seen. Immigrants shared stories about being told to stay quiet in courtrooms. In workplaces, in classrooms, and how Crockett's stance felt like their own voice breaking through. Howell, meanwhile, found her once fearsome reputation undercut in real time. Clips dissected her reaction frame by frame. The tightening grip on the gavel, the sharp inhale after Crockett's line, the faltering attempt to regain authority, commentators called. At the moment, Howell lost the room. Even allies of the establishment admitted privately at first, and publicly, that the judge looked rattled, diminished, almost exposed. The ripple effects extended beyond social media. Editorials painted Crockett as a symbol of a new kind. Of leadership, one not rooted in demands for respect, but in earning it through courage. Activists began citing her exchange as a rallying point. A reminder that speaking truth to power wasn't reckless. It was necessary. The footage played on jumbotrons at rallies, was quoted in sermons, and slipped into commencement speeches. Crockett's voice became more than a soundbite, became a declaration. Even opponents begrudgingly had to acknowledge her composure. One senior commentator summed it up: "You don't have to like her politics to respect what just happened. Crockett showed us what integrity under pressure really looks like." That reluctant respect may have stung Howell most of all. For years, the judge had relied on the weight of her authority to command silence. Now her authority had been punctured not by chaos, but by clarity. And still, Crockett wasn't satisfied with merely winning the viral moment. To her, it was never just about the clip, or the trending hashtag, or even the political boost. It was about something deeper. In interviews that followed, she reframed the narrative. This wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about reminding all of us, especially those who feel unseen, that dignity isn't negotiable. With those words, the victory deepened. Crockett had turned what could have been dismissed as a clash of personalities into a universal lesson. The resonance was undeniable. Courage over fear, integrity over arrogance, earned respect over blind obedience. Jasmine Crockett could have walked away from the moment satisfied. The clip had gone viral, Howell's composure had cracked, and the public had rallied around her. But Crockett understood something deeper. A victory without meaning was just noise. And so she reframed the entire exchange in her own words. It wasn't about humiliating Judge Howell, she said in a follow-up interview that itself went viral. It was about defending dignity, not just mine, but the dignity of every person who's ever been told to sit down, shut up, and accept arrogance as authority. That reframe shifted the spotlight. It wasn't about Crockett versus Howell anymore. It was about the timeless clash between two opposing forces and which one society chooses to elevate. She spelled it out in simple contrasts that resonated across political lines. Courage greater than fear, integrity greater than arrogance, earned. Respect greater than blind. Obedience, each phrase landed like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples outward. Students turned them into posters. Activists painted them on signs. Leaders quoted them on stage. And ordinary Americans, scrolling late at night, whispered them as reminders of what they wanted in those who claimed to represent them. Crockett leaned into the emotional core of her message. Leadership isn't about demanding respect, she declared, it's about deserving it. The line was instantly etched into the digital landscape. Commentators replayed it. Teachers wrote it on classroom whiteboards. Parents repeated it to their kids. It was the kind of phrase that outlives its speaker, because it distilled something universal into a truth anyone could carry. And in that distillation, Crockett touched something America desperately needed to hear. At a time when public trust in institutions was frayed, when arrogance too often paraded as authority, and when citizens felt more like subjects than participants, her words were a reminder. Respect cannot be coerced. It has to be earned, day by day, act by act. This was why the moment mattered far beyond a single courtroom. It wasn't just about a clash between a judge and a congresswoman. It was about how power is wielded in America and what people will accept from those in charge. Howell represented the old model: control through intimidation, authority without humility, respect demanded rather than deserved. Crockett embodied the new: clarity under pressure, principle over ego, and the kind of composure that proves leadership is service, not domination. The broader reflection was unavoidable. Across America, people began asking themselves who, in our workplaces, our communities, our politics, actually deserves respect, and who has simply demanded it by virtue of title, wealth, or position. The courtroom exchange became a mirror, forcing people to measure their own encounters with power against the standard Crockett had set. This was why opponents couldn't dismiss her as a grandstander. Because beneath the fire, there was substance. Beneath the sharpness, there was principle. Even those who disagreed with her politics found themselves nodding at her larger point. Respect, after all, is not partisan, it is human. The emotional crescendo carried a lesson for leaders everywhere. Dignity cannot be taken away by authority. It can only be surrendered. And when someone refuses to surrender it, even in the face of overwhelming pressure, it shakes the room. That refusal, embodied by Crockett in that courtroom, lit a fire that would burn far beyond the headlines of the week. And so the story shifted from a dramatic clash into something more enduring. Crockett hadn't just survived the test. She had transformed it into a teaching moment for a nation in search of authentic leadership. Because leadership, she reminded America, isn't about commanding silence or wielding fear. It's about embodying courage, integrity, earned respect in such a way that people choose to follow, not because they must, but because they believe. Crockett's moment in the spotlight wasn't defined by shouting or rage. It was defined by something far more powerful: clarity. In a setting designed to test her patience, she flipped the trial not through volume but through vision. She reminded everyone watching that true strength isn't about who can demand silence, but who can speak with purpose when silence is expected. The lesson rings louder than any headline or viral clip. Dignity will always rise above arrogance. Truth will always outlast intimidation. This wasn't just a skirmish in a courtroom. It was a statement about the kind of leadership America craves, leadership that earns respect rather than commands it. And now, the story doesn't just belong to Jasmine Crockett. It belongs to all of us. Every time we choose dignity over arrogance, integrity over ego, and courage over fear, we carry forward the spirit of this moment. That's the real legacy. Not just what happened in the trial, but what happens next in the lives of those inspired by it. If you believe in standing up to arrogance with dignity, subscribe. Hear this story and let your voice be heard. Every click, every share, every conversation sparked from this moment helps amplify a simple truth. Leadership is about service, not domination.